Hi, this is Haley, and I wanted to cover some of the basic drafting considerations for a California legislative resolution. In the California legislature, there are actually three types of resolutions. According to the Office of Legislative Counsel, two of these, the concurrent resolution and the joint resolution, require consideration and adoption by both houses of the legislature before they can take effect. The third type are individual House resolutions called an HR, a House resolution in the Assembly, and an SR or Senate resolution in that House. All three types of resolutions require only a simple majority vote for passage, and they are not considered by the governor. So none of those three go to the governor. The two that are passed by both houses, concurrent resolutions and joint resolutions, are actually given resolution chapter numbers by the Secretary of State once they've been adopted by both houses. So like other legislative measures, for a resolution, a title is drafted and a legislative council's digest is prepared that explains what the resolution proposes to do. Now, because there's not any existing law, there's no existing law section of the legislative council's digest. And usually for a resolution, there's also not a statement that says this bill would, but instead explains what the resolution would do, usually in one sentence. For example, in the 2019 session, Assembly Concurrent Resolution 80 was this measure would recognize the week of May 13th, 2019 to May 20th, 2019 as Infrastructure Week, and would urge the citizens of California to join in this special observance with appropriate events and commemorations. The Legislative Council's digest for a concurrent resolution, an ACR or an SCR, usually begins with the statement, this measure would. The Legislative Council's digest for a joint resolution, an AJR or an SJR, usually begins with this measure would urge the Congress and the President of the United States to. On the other hand, a House resolution, an HR or an SR, does not have a Legislative Council's digest, and instead it contains a simple heading that begins relative to, and then it explains it. In terms of the Legislative Council's digest keys, a House resolution does not contain any keys. But for concurrent and joint resolutions, there is a single digest key, that is fiscal committee. In other words, does that concurrent or joint resolution need to be re-referred to the fiscal committee for consideration of any possible fiscal impacts due to the language of that concurrent or joint resolution? After the digest and the key, then the text of the resolution begins. And resolutions utilize a numerous whereas clauses, and they conclude with at least two resolved clauses. There's no limitation on the number of whereas clauses that a resolution can contain. There's usually anywhere from 3 to 4 to 8 to 10, but half a dozen or so is the norm. Resolutions have two or sometimes three at the low mark, but some I've seen at a dozen or more. For a concurrent resolution that originates in the Assembly, the first resolve clause always begins with resolved by the Assembly of the State of California, the Senate thereof concurring, that the legislature, blah, blah, blah. For a joint resolution that originates, for example, in the Senate, the first resolve clause says, resolved by the Senate and the Assembly of the State of California jointly that the legislature urges the Congress of the United States to blank, and then whatever it's going to say. For a concurrent resolution that originates in the Assembly, the final resolve clause usually provides the following. Resolved that the chief clerk of the Assembly transmit copies of this resolution to the author for appropriate distribution. Similarly, for a joint resolution that originates in the Senate, the final resolve clause usually begins with resolved that the Secretary of the Senate transmit copies of this resolution to the President and the Vice President of the United States, to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, to the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, to each Senator and Representative from California in the Congress of the United States, and to the author for appropriate distribution. So for the most part, drafting a resolution in the California Legislature requires the bill drafter to utilize their other guidelines for bill drafting, as well as the required drafting style for resolutions.